Hello and welcome to another episode of the Feudal Future podcast. I'm Marshall Toplansky.
I'm Joel Kotkin.
And by the way, before we introduce our guests, I hope you enjoyed our new theme music that we just had written for us by one of my students at Chapman University, Colin White, who did a fantastic job at it. Big shout out to Colin. Thank you for doing that. And today we are delighted to have with us two fascinating perspectives on the future of Latinos in politics. First, we have Soledad Ursua, who is with us today. She is an investment professional and a member of the Venice Neighborhood Council, and wrote a really fascinating article in The American Mind about a year ago that I highly recommend, which is the Latino political future. It's all about conservatism among Latinos. Welcome very much, Soledad. Thanks for being here.
Thank you.
And Ruy Teixeira. Ruy is a globally known political scientist. His claim to fame started with his 2002 book on the inevitable democratic majority that Latinos would represent. And his most recent book, The Optimistic Leftist, takes a look at the 21st century and looks at how Latinos will be faring and how all of us will be faring in the coming century. Welcome, Ruy.
Hey, thanks. I'm glad to be here. I might also add, I have a forthcoming book with my old pal, John Judis, called Where Have All the Democrats Gone? Sort of a sequel to the emerging Democratic majority.
That sounds great.
What's happened to the Democrats? How did they get into the state they're in now, and politics in general in the last 20 years? And that'll come out in probably September of this year. So that's something to keep an eye out for.
Well, it's a really timely book because it's exactly the topic that we want to talk about today, which is the shifts that we're seeing in Latino politics. Joel, you want to kick us off?
Yeah, I mean, the first thing, and I'll start with Roy, but obviously Soledad would want to get your views as well. You know, you and many others thought, well, with the Latinos becoming a bigger and bigger part of the population and the electorate, that this would ensure that the Democrats would have a permanent majority. Why didn't that happen?
Well, a good question. First of all, I should clarify that the Emerging Democratic Majority as a book and its related thesis were somewhat misunderstood at the time, and subsequently. John Judis and I, when we wrote the book, were never claiming that Democrats would have an inevitable majority, certainly not a permanent one. It was more trying to look at the shifting terrain of US politics and making the case that a lot of these changes tilted the terrain in the Democrats' favor, and then if they played their cards right, they could definitely have a dominant period within American politics. And there's always a few stipulations to that. One was that, very importantly, the Democrats couldn't afford to lose too much more ground among the white working class. It's just clear from looking at the numbers that the Democrats needed to keep even if minority, a solid share of that vote. They couldn't afford to lose a lot of ground in it because it's so big and so important, particularly in certain states. So that would have to underpin this majority, that you couldn't just rely on these emerging constituencies. The second point is sort of an obvious mathematical one, but I think people just, they have a hard time wrapping their minds around it. Just because a group is growing that favors you doesn't mean the net effect of that will automatically redound to your benefit if it's the case that that group starts moving against you politically. In other words, whatever ground you're making up just by the group becoming larger can be negated, and then some, by the group moving away from you politically, so that your margin among that group declines, which of course is what's happening with Hispanics. So that's kind of where we are today. The Democrats, I think, did assume that as the Hispanic population got larger was an unalloyed benefit, and there was really nothing else they needed to do, but they kind of left a little bit out of the equation, which you've got to retain the loyalties of Hispanics and keep them voting 2-to-1 Democratic or more. And if you don't, you're not going to get as much juice from that lemon as you thought you were going to get. And that's exactly what we've seen happen as we've seen big margin shifts against the Democrats as their advantage among Hispanics overall and in large parts of the country has declined significantly. We saw that especially in the 2020 election, which absolutely blew Democrats' minds because, you know, hey, they're running against Donald Trump for the second time. Trump is evil. He hates immigrants. He hates Latinos. He's a racist. Therefore, everybody should vote for us. Didn't turn out to be the point. The Democratic margin among Hispanics nationwide declined by about 16 points. It was more in places like Florida, but it was all over the place. It was in Nevada. It was in California. It was in neighborhoods in Chicago and Detroit and, you know, New York and so on. So it was really quite remarkable. And it just turns out to be the case that Hispanics don't have as much of a presumption, unshakable presumption toward the Democrats as many Democrats thought. That in fact, there are a lot of moderate to conservative Latinos who were fine, sort of fine-ish or with the Democrats when they didn't seem to be moving so far to the left in cultural issues. But once they did, they really started asking questions about it. And I mean, one way to think about it is that moderate, especially conservative Latinos were not voting their ideology, right? I mean, they were just voting Democratic way more than they should have based on their underlying political view of the world. And what started to shift, among other things, in 2020, still with us today, is some of these voters are sort of operationalizing their ideology, if you want to think about it that way. They're no longer willing to vote against their ideology and in favor of the Democrats because they now have so many questions about the Democrats. Doesn't mean necessarily love the Republicans, but a lot of them are now dislike the Democrats more. And there's always been aspects to the Hispanic community in terms of its patriotism, its, you know, sort of upward mobility, its value for hard work, its relatively traditionalist view toward the family. There's a lot of things that, you know, didn't fit in that well with the Democrats, you know, arguably to begin with, or there were sort of problems there at any rate. And now those problems have really come to the fore. And Hispanics, they just don't think of themselves as, you know, like the victims of a white supremacist society who live in a state of, you know, live in this dystopian hellhole we call America. That's just not the way they think about things. They want to get ahead. They value their families, their communities. They want safe communities. They want good jobs. They want a good education and so on and so forth. And for a while, you know, and still today, I mean, the majority of Hispanics tend to favor the Democrats, but, you know, it makes a big difference when that margin declines. And that's exactly what we're seeing today.
Soledad, what's your take on this?
So, I mean, this is the $1 million question, right? Did Latinos leave the Democratic Party or did the Democratic Party leave them? So it's both, right? Because when you take a step back and you take a look just from a pure socioeconomic perspective, Latinos are the new middle class. You know, I'm third generation. So, you know, my grandmother, she picked fruit. She met my grandfather picking fruit in Salinas. She was illiterate. She had to go to work in the fields from a young age. But you see that 3 generations later, I have a master's degree. I'm living on the West Side. And so my story is not uncommon. You know, this is what happens. We naturally start to assimilate after 3 to 4 generations. And what you see now is that we have become the middle class, where we are the new small business owners. We are homeowners. We now have middle class virtues where we're concerned with savings, educational attainment. And for that reason, when you look at what's happening, when we're the new middle class, that means we have the most to lose with many of California's regressive policies. And what have the Democrats done? You know, what they've done is they've also lurched left. They've enacted high tax, anti-mobility efforts. And so, you know, the Democratic Party has changed very much as well. They've started to embrace socialism. When you look back to Latinos who overwhelmingly supported Barack Obama for his presidential run, Barack Obama would be considered a conservative today. So the party has very much changed, but at the same time, Latinos have changed. We are assimilating. We are, you know, what we care about is opportunity and making sure that the next generation does better than the last.
Marshall, you're muted.
You're muted.
Sorry about that. A question for both of you. Are the shift, this generational shift that you're describing, Soledad, is this something that you think is true for Latinos across America, or is it more in places like California where we've seen more economic growth?
I think California is very different because we are Mexican American, we're Chicanos. And so here we have a good, 4 or 5 generations now that have been living in California. So that's different because not all Latinos are Mexican Americans. So I think it's very different, but it really depends on, how long somebody's been in the United States, how many generations they've been. And I mean, think about the Latinos who are, they're Cubans in Miami. They have a completely different viewpoint, right? They're very conservative. But I think what you see is that just over time, Latinos start to tend to move conservative.
Well, I guess I got a comment on that. I mean, I guess one thing I'd slightly disagree with Soledad's interpretation is I think it's right that a lot of Latinos are turned off by any association with socialism, and they're certainly very oriented toward opportunity and upward mobility. And to some extent, a lot of them there was some good feelings about Trump because they felt the economy worked pretty well under his aegis, and they gave him credit, maybe more than he deserved. But at any rate, there was a lot of negative reactions to keeping the economy closed as long as it was in a lot of places, which actually connects to the main point I want to make, which is about the class question. If you look at where the Democrats have lost the most support among Hispanics, it is not among college-educated Hispanics. It is not among those who have had the most upward mobility. It is actually among those who, seek that upward mobility. It's among non-college educated working class Hispanics, which is the overwhelming majority of the Hispanic population, the most working class race ethnic group in the United States. So if you look at where the Democratic advantage declined in state after state and nationally, it's been more among working class Hispanics than among college educated Hispanics. So I think that's a slight modification of Soledad's thesis. It's the people who are seeking upward mobility rather than those who already attained it, whatever generation they are. And also I think that highlights, therefore, the kind of cultural question, because I think a lot of these working class Hispanics, they are pretty traditional in their attitude toward social issues, and they just don't get, they just don't get it. What are these Democrats up to? They seem to be concerned with all this other stuff that they couldn't care less about and don't even understand. And they seem to be losing the plot about helping me get ahead in life, which is what I care the most about.
Well, what is the, and this is for both of you really, what are the things that the Republicans need to do to attract more Hispanics? And what are the dangers of some of their the positions that may take place? I mean, because it's one thing not to be a Democrat; it's another thing to be a Republican.
For sure.
Roy or Soledad, you want to address that?
Well, I will say one thing. I thought it was a disappointment among the Republicans not to have chosen someone like Harmeet Dillon to represent them at the national level. I think that was a big missed opportunity. I'm not one who usually talks about identity politics, but the face of conservatives are changing, especially in the Southwest, and the future of the GOP, it really should be picking up people of color. And so that was a huge missed opportunity in my mind, because somebody like President Trump, he's very blue collar. I think Latinos would still support somebody like Ron DeSantis. But if we go back to the old GOP ways of Mitt Romney, it's a much harder sell, because that's the traditional, Republican sort of, entitled person. So it's not going to translate. So I think if the GOP really wants to court Latinos, it's really, making them part of the party, promoting them. And so I really do think that needs to change.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a reasonable point. I mean, I think that the level of outreach and sort of the commitment Republicans need to have to bring more Hispanics, especially Hispanics, but certainly also Black voters, Asian voters into the party is not quite where it should be. But I think there are some deeper underlying problems that Republicans face in trying to make continued inroads among this constituency. I think one is that if you look at the economic policies of the Republicans versus the Democrats, I do think the Republicans are still pretty dominated by a sort of more libertarian economic kind of outlook, which Soledad may disagree with this, but I think this is not really a good sell for Hispanics. They have nothing against, government services that actually work. They have nothing against government intervention in the economy. They want upward mobility, but they're actually relatively sympathetic to a relatively large role for government. And Republicans tend to favor policies, or at least that's been the case in the past, that have more favored the well-off in society rather than less well-off. So I think that's a problem that Republicans are going to have to deal with. And I think you see Republicans like Josh Hawley and Marco Rubio and people like that trying to promulgate a view of economics and a sort of populist orientation that would put some meat on the bones of what Trump supposedly stood for. But I think that's got far to go. So I think that's something that sort of stands in their way. I think another thing they need to be careful about is I obviously think that the Democrats have moved too far to the left on cultural issues, and that does alienate a lot of these voters. But on the other hand, if you look at the underlying data, a lot of these Hispanics, they may disdain, some of the craziness coming out of the Democrats, but they're not that hard line on a lot of these issues necessarily. And they're more inclined toward tolerance. They're, moderate supporters of abortion rights. There's a lot of ways in which the profile of sort of the median working class Hispanic, while very different than sort of where the Democrats are coming from these days, does not fit with some of the harder edge elements in the Republican Party either. And so to the extent Republicans put that foot forward, as opposed to just standing up against Democratic excesses and being for a tolerant, sort of a tolerant traditionalism, as it were, I think they could have problems as well. So I think that's, it's not like the Democrats are the only ones with problems here. The Republicans have problems too. And it's now a sort of, we're poised in a delicate balance to see how much farther this will tilt toward the Republicans, and there are problems both parties have to face in terms of making that balance turn out more in their favor than today.
Let me ask a historical perspective question. Are what we seeing with the Latino community in terms of kind of this shift of let's call it liberal without a party label on it, right? Kind of liberal to conservative shift. Does this have historical precedent with other immigrant groups? Is this kind of the natural life cycle of what happens in immigrant communities, or is the Latino story a unique one?
Well, I don't think we really know, I think there's always a sort of facile kind of trope about how, well, the immigrants get here and then after a while they get assimilated and they all become conservative. And that's not really true. And certainly the timelines along which it occurs vary dramatically. And there are reasons why people start moving suddenly toward the Republicans. If you look at the evolution of Italian and Irish, for example, who moved toward the Republicans, there's still actually some residual pro-Democrat feeling in a lot of these communities, but there were things that happened in the political economy and the politics of America in the 60s and 70s that actually propelled a lot of these voters toward. So it wasn't just simply they'd been around longer. Stuff happened and they reacted to the stuff that happened. But it's certainly the case that any immigrant group that comes over here and starts out with a very pro-democratic orientation, or really pro anybody else, I suppose, there's no logical reason to assume they'll always stay the same. Stuff happens. Yeah, generational turnover is important. Yeah, exogenous events are important. Yeah,
well, and
stuff happens.
When
realignments happen.
When success happens, people tend to be more interested in maintaining their
right. And when the success stops, they're less interested. So you could make the case that if you look at the post-World War II era, which is a tremendously successful era for moving working class people into the middle class economically, which affected a lot of these groups, it really slowed down in the late 60s and early 70s, along with a lot of the social issues that came to the fore. And the Democrats sort of lost their purchase on a lot of these sectors of the working class. But it wasn't just they'd been around longer. It was that stuff happened and they felt like the Democrats no longer represented them that well.
But let me ask you just a quick follow-up question, which, and maybe I'll ask it for Soledad. State of California, for instance, Hispanics continue to vote heavily Democratic, I think more than they do, let's say, in Texas. So is this part of what Ruy is saying, which is in California, opportunities for working class people are just not very good relative to other states? So if, let's say, the economy it gets weaker, isn't there a possibility that more Hispanics will vote for the Democrats just because they want the transfer payments, or and that they feel that the private sector economy left to its own would not do very well for them?
Well, I think too, people sort of take Latinos for granted. Our political ideology is not part of our overall ideology. We are going to vote with our pocketbook. We're going to vote for opportunity. And let's look at, education, right? That is really, that is the way to achieve the American dream. It's all through education. And look at California's recent test scores. It shows that Black and brown kids can't read or do math. So 70% Black kids cannot do, they can't read at state standards. 64% of Hispanics cannot read at state standards. And math is worse. 84% of Black kids and 79% of Hispanic kids do not meet state math requirements. And so that is very troubling for public education. And so what you will see is that Latinos overwhelmingly support school choice. And that's something that the Democrats are heavily against. I think this will be one of the issues that will really come out to maybe break Latinos off from the Democratic Party. We want opportunities, we want a better future, and really education is the first stepping stone in achieving all of that.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with a lot of that. I guess I'm less sanguine about the school choice issue in particular, but I don't think there's any way around the fact that, a lot of educational systems in our country are failing their students, particularly poor Black and Latino students, and that's very much the case in California. And I do think this is hugely important because of the way, not only how important it is to this constituency, but in a raw political sense, if you look at the way the Democrats have been moving in terms of education curricula, the issues that are coming to the fore, I mean, it's just utterly bizarre that you have this situation where a lot of these Black, Latino, poor students, are getting such a terrible education, just don't have, aren't getting the basics, right? Reading, math, sort of literacy. I mean, what's wrong with this picture? Why are people then sort of insisting on sparking all these controversies about, sort of a race-centric curriculum and, sensitivity to, sort of making schools anti-racist and renaming them, and sort of bringing a lot of essentially what's ideology into the classrooms. People aren't interested in ideology in the classrooms for their kids. They don't want them to get an anti-racist education or a gender fluid education. They want them to get a fucking education, And I think to the extent the Democrats have become dissociated with that very fundamental commitment, I think it's really going to hurt them. I think, first of all, with the Asian community, and then second with the Hispanic community, because these people want upward mobility, as Soledad's pointing out, and education is the prime vehicle for that upward mobility. So if you can't give their kids a damn good education, what are you here for? So, that certainly puts a lot of things into play in terms of reforming the educational system. Certainly school choice would be one of them, but there's lots of others as well. And then that creates a problem for the Democrats because they're sort of mobbed up with the teachers unions and, the educational bureaucracy, which has gone in very weird directions in the last 10 years. And I think it's a problem. They don't know how to move. The Democrats don't know how to move these levers to make things better, which then creates an opening for the other side and for stuff like school choice.
Well, especially as we're seeing the economy reorganize around technology-centric kinds of motive power, right? The interesting question is going to be, what is it going to take for the Democrats and the leadership on the liberal side of the aisle to see that there is, that change, that the choices they've made are not really working for the 21st century? What is the catalyst? What needs to happen in order to be able to make a meaningful shift that'll benefit Latinos as well as everybody, obviously, but specifically Latinos? What is that catalyst?
Well, I think losing, right? I mean, usually the case for parties. If you lose, it provokes rethinking. If you don't lose, you're less likely to rethink. If we look at Hispanics in particular, the Democrats are still dominating that constituency. I mean, I'd say there's still a lot of happy talk in the Democratic Party and in those circles about, well, yeah, our margins are going down, but they're still overwhelmingly voted for us anyway. They'll come back. These conservative Latinos are just turning out at too high rates. There's other, real Hispanics waiting in the weeds to vote for the Democrats who we're just going to mobilize. Plus, the Republicans are crazy and they'll get disenchanted with them soon. There's a lot of sort of standard issue replies to the obvious deterioration of Hispanic support for Democrats. But that becomes less easy to sustain if those losses get larger. I mean, if Hispanics go from being 2-to-1 to a 60-40 and then to a 55-45 constituency consistently, that's when, I think people will panic. But I don't think we're there yet, so they're not panicking, so they're not changing much. And, this also intersects with a lot of broader issues with the Democratic Party in general, in terms of how it is able to win elections in a lot of areas of the country, its inability to, sort of get off the current stalemate between the parties, how it does with white working class voters, how it does in small town, rural, and exurban America. It's all one big problem. And, sort of as John Judis and I explain in our new book, I mean, it's an evolution of longstanding, and it's something the Democrats are very much, challenged with in terms of actually changing their approach so that they can break out of this stalemate, of which one component would be turning back or moving back the Hispanic voting support closer to what it used to be instead of this continued deterioration we see today. So that's kind of a long-winded way of saying they got to get whacked over the, by the side of the head with a 2x4 before they're likely to do much.
Well,
I wish it wasn't true, but it probably is.
Last word on this from you.
So I definitely agree. I think the Democrats are not taking it serious. I printed out this tweet I wanted to show you that Joe Biden posted yesterday. He says, I ran for president to build an economy for middle-class families. And a big part of that is working to bring down everyday costs from medicine to gas. Here he's lowering energy bills. Here he's lowering gas prices. So, I looked it up.
Yeah.
When Joe Biden took office in January 20th, 2021, gas was $2.39 nationally. This week, it's $3.42 a gallon nationally. And in California, because we pay way more, it's $4.6 a gallon. So Latinos feel that every day at the pump. The costs are just getting out of control. I don't know if you've been following what's happening with SoCal Gas. Our natural gas bills are going to skyrocket. They're going up about 300%. So what SoCal Gas has done is they've given out an estimate. A bill which would have cost you $130 is now going to be $315. So again, these are all, these huge costs. And then even look at some of just all these increase in costs. So look at eggs. The cost of eggs is, reaching $8 a dozen now. And that's sort of a mix from some, there was some avian flu, but also in California, we passed this law to give chickens enough time to be able to, walk around outside. So it turns out that these woke policies are very expensive. And think about families, $8 for a dozen eggs. It's so everywhere, it's this assault, of increased costs and diminished opportunity. And then don't forget inflation. That is perhaps the most regressive of all taxes. And it hits low-income families the hardest and working class families. So at a certain point, unless the Democrats can turn the ship around and fix the economy, people will vote with their wallet. And right now it would be moving them out.
I can't resist one last question, but just because what Soledad brought up. Roy, you've been writing some great stuff about the climate change agenda of the Democrats and how that
Right.
affects, and our colleague Jennifer Hernandez has done a lot of work on this. Is climate change one of the issues that could drive more Hispanics into the Republican Party?
Oh, sure. I mean, I think that on a very visceral level of jobs, there's a lot of Hispanics in resource extraction industries, oil and gas, which may be threatened. But of course, the bigger issue is what happens to the price reliability, of energy. And what people really want is, it certainly includes Hispanics, is cheap, reliable, abundant energy. And it's just a very, I think, compelling argument that this green transition that the Democrats are attempting to step on the accelerator for is not going to produce any of the above. It actually may make energy more expensive, less reliable, and less abundant. So, I think there's huge problems with this. I think that the Democrats are in thrall, as it were, to a sort of almost ideology about climate change, about this catastrophe that we must at all costs, restructure our economy as fast as possible to avoid. I think that's vastly exaggerated. And I think the fact of the matter is, as a great Vaclav Smil points out, that it will take decades and decades and decades to actually make a real transition in the energy system. In the meantime, you actually are going to have to continue to rely on fossil fuels. And this insane quest to zero them out as fast as possible is not going to have a good effect on workers and consumers, of which Hispanics are an important part. Because as I mentioned, they are an overwhelmingly working class constituency. And how are they going to react if the energy problems sort of evolve as I think they're likely to do, if the Democrats continue to be so obsessively focused on this? So yes, I think the Democrats' climate change obsession and green transition obsession is something that will also endanger them with this constituency.
Well, I'd like to thank all of you for being part of the Feudal Future podcast. Some fascinating stuff today. Thank you, and we look forward to having you with us in a future podcast.
And particularly, Roy, when your book comes out, we will have you and John Judis on. Would be great.
Oh, sure. That'd be fun.
Great.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Bye.
All right, thank you.
The Feudal Future.